It was supposed to be our trip, the one where we would escape from everything, work, obligations, the noise of the city, and the grind of everyday life. A chance to recharge in the crisp mountain air of the Alps. The plans were laid out carefully, a week-long getaway that would involve skiing down the powdery slopes, cozying up by a roaring fire, and simply enjoying each other's company in a place so beautiful it almost felt unreal. I had picked out the perfect resort, complete with a ski-in, ski-out experience, so we wouldn't even have to waste time getting to the mountain. All we had to do was fly in, and then, bliss. But it didn't happen like that, not even close. The day started with so much promise. The anticipation was thick in the air. We woke up early, both eager to start the trip. I had packed everything, my ski gear, extra layers for the cold, and some books for the flight. I remember how I double-checked the weather reports. It was going to be a great week for skiing. I was excited. No, I was beyond excited. It had been months since I'd had a chance to really ski, and I was itching to get out on those slopes. But little did I know that it would be a mistake that would make me regret every moment leading up to this. We made our way to the airport with plenty of time. I drove while my wife scrolled through her phone, occasionally chatting about what she'd packed or mentioning something she forgot to bring. She was always the planner, the one who handled the details. I trusted her with that. I had always trusted her. And it wasn't like this was the first time we'd been on a trip, not by a long shot. Flights were something we both knew how to handle, and it wasn't the first time she'd bought tickets. So, I didn't think twice when she told me she'd taken care of everything. We pulled into the parking lot and made our way to the terminal. Everything seemed routine. But then, I saw the clerk at check-in glance at our tickets, then look back at me with a slight frown. Something wasn't right. I asked if everything was okay, and she told me to step aside for a second. It wasn't until she said the words, "You've got the wrong flight," that the rug was pulled out from under me. I stood there, staring at her. "What do you mean the wrong flight?" She checked the ticket again, then turned the screen to me. The airport code, VIE. I'd been staring at those letters for a moment before they registered. Vienna. We're flying to Vienna, not Geneva. The blood drained from my face. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or to punch the wall. My mind was racing. Vienna, Austria, not Geneva, Switzerland. That's where we were supposed to be heading. I could already picture the Alps in my mind, snow-covered peaks, crisp mountain air, and the warmth of a ski lodge waiting for us after a day of carving through the slopes. But now, we weren't even close. She apologized immediately. I thought I booked the right tickets," my wife stammered, her voice thin, strained. "I swear I didn't realize it until now. I just booked what was available." I could hear the panic rising in her voice. I could see the guilt written all over her face. She was trying to keep it together, but her hands were shaking as she fumbled with her phone. I felt the frustration bubbling inside of me. Not anger, not yet. Just pure confusion and disbelief. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. I kept asking myself how this even happened. But no matter how much I replayed it in my head, it didn't change anything. The flight was already booked, and there was no going back now. The clerk tried to be helpful, offering us options to reschedule or change the destination. But the flights to Geneva were all full, and our only other option was to take a flight to Zurich the next day, a route that was miles away from our original plan. The chance of skiing in the Alps seemed like a far-off dream. My stomach turned at the thought of a wasted day, wasted money, and most importantly, a wasted trip. We stood there for a moment. I could feel the heaviness in the air. I turned to look at my wife. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was staring at the floor, fiddling with her phone, avoiding eye contact. It was a strange feeling, knowing she had let me down this badly. It wasn't just about the trip anymore. It was about the trust I'd placed in her to get this right. How could she not double-check something so crucial? My brain was still trying to catch up to the situation. Everything I'd planned for this trip was collapsing in front of me. A few weeks ago, I was planning our ski itinerary with excitement. I had even researched the best slopes, the best après-ski bars in Geneva, and the hot spots for our dinners. Now, I had to rewrite the entire plan on the fly. It was going to take hours, maybe days, for me to shift gears mentally and emotionally. I grabbed my phone and checked the Swiss flight options myself. Nothing. Not a single reasonable flight that would get us to Geneva in time for skiing. The ski resort we had booked was located deep in the Swiss Alps, and there was no way we could make it on time. My wife started talking again, but I couldn't focus on her words anymore. She was apologizing again and again, but the more she apologized, the worse it felt. We weren't going to the Alps, we weren't going skiing, we weren't going to the place I'd dreamed about, and there was nothing either of us could do to fix it now. We were stuck in the wrong place, on the wrong flight, with no way out. "I'm so sorry," she said, looking up at me with wide, desperate eyes. "I'll make it up to you. We can still have a great time. Vienna's beautiful. We'll make the best of it." Vienna, the city of history and culture, of art and museums. I wasn't interested in museums. I wasn't interested in culture. I was interested in snow, in slopes, and in skiing. But none of that mattered anymore. I didn't want to start a fight, but the anger was still there, buried deep inside. I didn't know how to express it. It wasn't her fault in the traditional sense. This was an honest mistake, but damn, it was frustrating. The trip was supposed to be a reset for both of us, but now it felt like the reset had been erased with one stupid mistake. We spent the rest of the day in silence, driving back to the hotel we'd booked. I didn't want to argue. What was there to argue about? She messed up, and now we had to deal with the consequences. But the anger still simmered inside me. I hated that I was disappointed, and I hated that I didn't know how to deal with it. We were supposed to be in the Alps, but instead we were stuck here. The next few days in Vienna were a blur of forced smiles, half-hearted attempts to enjoy the city, and awkward silences that seemed to stretch on forever. My wife tried to make the best of it, but the energy was gone. All I could think about was the ski trip that never was. After the initial blow of the wrong flight, we eventually found ourselves on the plane to Vienna. The trip was delayed, naturally, because why wouldn't it be? Everything had been going wrong up until this point, so why stop now? My head was still reeling from the earlier frustration, but I had to try and get into the right mindset. Vienna could still be fun, right? At least it was a city with a lot to offer: art, history, culture. My wife was doing her best to keep the mood light, offering half-hearted suggestions about what we could do when we landed. She kept trying to make plans. "We should check out the museums," she said. "Maybe go to the opera tonight." It was like she didn't even know me anymore. I sat there, pretending to care, trying not to let the disappointment settle too heavily on my shoulders. The problem was that I didn't want to go to a museum or the opera. I wanted the cold wind of the Alps against my face. I wanted the rush of snow beneath my feet, the joy of carving through fresh powder, the sound of skis slicing through the snow. I wanted to be in the place I had planned for, with the energy and excitement of the slopes in my blood. But here I was, staring out the window at a clear sky over Europe, heading toward a city that I had never really cared much about. The romantic visions of skiing in the Alps had been replaced with the reality of museums and city tours. I couldn't shake it off. No matter how much I tried to focus on my wife's words, or even the view outside the window, there was a gnawing emptiness that wouldn't go away. As the flight went on, things seemed to get worse. I was tired from the lack of sleep, the stress of the mishap, and just the general tension in the air. My wife was talking more, trying to fill the silence, but I couldn't find myself responding the way I normally did. She was sitting next to me, but it felt like we were miles apart. Then it happened. The man in the seat next to us caught her attention. I don't know if it was the way he looked or if it was just the circumstances, but suddenly, my wife seemed a little too eager to engage with him. He was well-dressed, late 20s, with a sharp jawline and an air of confidence that was hard to ignore. He leaned forward to ask her about her plans in Vienna, and she gave him the usual answers, a soft smile on her face, trying to make conversation. There was nothing inherently wrong with it. I mean, we were both on a flight, but then I noticed something. She laughed a little too hard at his jokes. Her smile lingered a little longer than usual. Her body language was just a touch too open. The way she shifted in her seat, the way she leaned forward just a bit too much. It wasn't anything overt, not in the beginning, but the signals were clear if you were paying attention, and I was paying attention too much. I felt a jolt of irritation in my chest. What the hell was this? We were supposed to be together, but here she was, engaged in what felt like a little flirtation with some stranger. The guy clearly noticed the attention too. His posture shifted from casual to confident, even cocky. He threw in a few more compliments, made a few more jokes, and each time my wife would giggle or smile, in that way that made me feel like I wasn't even in the room. She was still talking to me, but her eyes kept darting to him, her focus shifting every few seconds. It was like she was trying to split her attention, trying to balance us both out, and failing miserably. I stayed quiet for a while, trying to let it go. I told myself it was nothing, that I was being overly sensitive, but in that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The excitement for this trip that had been bubbling in her just days before now felt like a distant memory, replaced by some new fascination with this guy sitting next to us. Then it got worse. He leaned over to her, just a little too close, and asked if she wanted to check out some cool spots in Vienna. I didn't catch all the details of their conversation, but the tone had shifted. It was subtle, but I could feel the change in the air. My wife was responding in ways that felt more personal. She was no longer just a friendly tourist answering questions. She was playing along, as if the lines between what was appropriate and what was not had been blurred. I didn't know how to feel. Anger, embarrassment. Was she flirting with this guy on purpose? Was I overreacting, or was this the kind of thing that would later come back to haunt me? I tried to swallow the bitterness rising in my throat, but it wasn't easy. I kept my head down, pretending to focus on something else. But I wasn't really focused on anything. The awkwardness in the air was palpable. My mind kept racing. What if I was imagining it? What if I was just projecting my disappointment onto something that wasn't there? But the longer they talked, the more it felt like she was enjoying his attention. The more I wanted to get off that damn plane. I couldn't wait for this flight to end. Eventually, the seatbelt sign came on, and the moment was broken. We started to prepare for landing. The tension in the air didn't dissipate, but at least we had something else to focus on. My wife turned to me, gave me a distracted smile, and muttered something about being excited to check into the hotel. I nodded, but didn't respond. The thought of her flirting with him, however innocent it seemed, still lingered in my mind. As the plane touched down in Vienna, I knew things weren't as they should be. It wasn't just the misstep with the flight, or the fact that I was no longer looking forward to the trip. It was the little moments that had piled up. Her flirtation, her attention diverted elsewhere, her disconnection from me. We got off the plane, and the reality of the situation set in. We were in Vienna. The city was there, sprawling before us with all its culture and history, but all I could feel was this uncomfortable weight hanging over me. The next few days in Vienna were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the air between us had shifted in a way I couldn't fix. Despite the city's beauty, despite all the culture and the museums and the opera that she'd planned, I felt utterly disconnected from her. It was like we were strangers on a trip we had to finish because there was no other option. Every time I tried to talk to her, it felt forced. Every conversation seemed to slip away like sand through my fingers. I couldn't stop thinking about the guy on the plane, and I couldn't stop thinking about how my wife had acted. I wasn't a jealous person by nature, but this time, something was different. Her little smiles, the way her attention kept drifting to him. It was as though I wasn't there, as if I was invisible. In the back of my mind, I kept telling myself to let it go, to focus on the bigger picture, but I couldn't. It ate at me. By the time we made it to the ski resort in the Alps, the tension had built to the point where I could barely look at her without feeling that familiar pit in my stomach. Everything about the resort was perfect. The snowy mountains, the crisp air, the anticipation of hitting the slopes, all of it was supposed to fix things, but I wasn't sure it could anymore. She seemed to be in better spirits once we were there, and I tried to match her energy. I didn't want to ruin this for her. It was important to me that we still had some fun. She was excited to hit the slopes, and I pretended to be too, but the whole time, I kept catching glimpses of the weird way she was looking at the instructors. She kept eyeing the snowboarders as they zipped by on the mountain, and I couldn't help but notice how she glanced at one instructor in particular. His name was Derek, tall, athletic, with that cool guy vibe that was impossible to ignore. He was clearly good at his job, and he had an easy charm about him. But there was something more. It was the way she looked at him when she thought I wasn't paying attention. The first few days were just the usual trip activities, skiing, sightseeing, the occasional dinner. But then, on the fourth day, everything changed. We had signed up for a snowboarding lesson, a way to try something new. I had zero interest in snowboarding, but I went along with it for her sake. I should have known something was off from the start. She was unusually giddy, far more excited about it than I expected her to be. She was practically bouncing with excitement, and Derek, the instructor, took a special interest in her from the start. They had this easy rapport, a kind of chemistry that I hadn't seen from her in a long time. Every time Derek said something, she laughed a little too loud, her gaze lingering just a bit too long. I could see how his eyes followed her as she tried out the snowboarding techniques. It was all too much. The smiles, the compliments, the way they stood a little too close to each other. I tried to shake it off, tried to ignore the gnawing feeling of discomfort, but it was impossible. That evening, after the lesson, we went back to the lodge. She was excited, talking about how much fun she had, but I could tell she was distracted. She kept looking at her phone, checking messages and texting. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe she was catching up with friends or just sharing the day's events, but it didn't sit right with me. Later that night, I went out to grab a drink at the lodge's bar, trying to clear my head. The place was packed, with people from all over the world, but my thoughts kept drifting back to her and Derek. I wasn't paranoid, but the way she was acting was starting to get to me. It felt like she was hiding something, and I hated the feeling. When I came back to the room, she wasn't there. I checked the time. It was late. Normally, she'd be in bed by now, especially with how tired we'd both been after the day's snowboarding. I called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. The knot in my stomach grew tighter. I tried to keep my cool, but something told me this wasn't just about late-night drinks. I put on my jacket, decided to step out, and look for her. The snow had picked up again, making it even harder to navigate the winding paths of the resort. As I stepped outside, I noticed something strange. A familiar figure walking in the distance, but not far enough to be out of sight. It was her, but she wasn't alone. Derek was with her. My heart sank. They were talking, laughing, and the way their bodies were positioned, it was obvious that they were walking close, too close for comfort. I wasn't imagining things anymore. I felt sick, my breath quickening, as I tried to process what I was seeing. I followed them, staying just far enough behind that they wouldn't notice me. They stopped at a secluded part of the resort, near a small lodge. I tried to steady my breathing, tried to tell myself to turn back, to not let my mind run wild, but I couldn't. My feet were moving before I could stop them. I saw them enter a small room near the back of the building, a place I hadn't seen before. It was quiet, isolated. My pulse raced as I quietly approached the window, crouching down to stay out of sight. And then I saw it. They weren't just talking anymore. They were kissing. The kind of kiss that told me everything I needed to know. She was with him, not just some casual flirtation, but something real. My stomach twisted, a sickening mix of betrayal and disbelief. It was happening right in front of my eyes. The woman I loved, my wife, was with another man, a man who had been so charming and friendly with her all this time. I didn't know what to do. My body felt frozen in place, as if I was paralyzed, watching something I could never unsee. But then it got worse. As I watched them, I saw them undress, their bodies coming together in a way that shattered everything. The final blow. There it was, the undeniable proof that the distance between us wasn't just emotional anymore. It was physical, raw, and completely real. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. Every step away from that window felt like a step further into a nightmare I couldn't escape. I didn't know what to think anymore, didn't know what to do with the pain surging through my veins. But the truth was in front of me, and there was no denying it. It wasn't just about skiing anymore. It was about us. It had been one of those weeks where everything seemed to hit you all at once. I'd been swamped at work with deadlines and conference calls, and Clara, my girlfriend of 2 years, had been distant lately. I knew something was off, but I couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was the stress of everyday life, or maybe it was the fact that our relationship, once so vibrant, felt like it was slipping away. That Friday evening, I had planned a quiet night in. I ordered takeout, set up the living room with candles, and even queued up our favorite movie, anything to get us back on track. I texted Clara earlier in the day, letting her know my plans, hoping she'd be home to spend the evening with me. But when I got home from work, Clara wasn't there. Her car wasn't in the driveway, and the lights in the house were dim, like she had been gone for a while. At first I didn't think much of it. Maybe she went out to meet some friends. It wasn't unusual for her to go out, but she usually at least told me beforehand. But this time, there was no text, no call, nothing. It wasn't until 10 p.m. that I started getting uneasy. I texted her, asking where she was. No reply. I called, but the phone rang endlessly. That's when I knew something wasn't right. Clara had always been good about keeping in touch when she was out. This was out of character for her. The night dragged on. I paced around the apartment, flicking through channels on the TV, without really watching anything. My mind started to wander. Was she with someone else? Had something happened to her? These irrational thoughts filled my head, and I couldn't shake them. Finally, around 2 a.m., Clara strolled through the front door, acting as if nothing was wrong. She flashed me a smile and casually dropped her purse on the kitchen counter. "Hey," she said. "Sorry, I lost track of time. It was a crazy night." I didn't respond at first. I was too stunned. The nonchalance in her voice was unnerving. Something about it felt off. She didn't look like she had just had a casual night out with friends. Her eyes avoided mine, her tone was a little too cheerful, and there was something about her behavior that made me feel uneasy. "Where were you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Oh, you know, just out," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "Nothing special." I wasn't convinced. There was an edge to her words, a lie buried in the way she spoke. I wanted to press her, but I didn't. Maybe it was my own insecurity, or maybe I just didn't want to face the truth. Instead, I nodded, not saying much more, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, I met up with my friend Ben at a cafe. Ben and I had been friends for years, since college actually. He was a DJ and had played gigs all over the city. We sat down, exchanged pleasantries, and started talking about the usual stuff, work, music, life in general. But then, Ben casually dropped something that made my stomach flip. "Hey, man," he said nonchalantly. "I saw Clara last night. She was at the club you like, Rockwave, right?" My heart skipped a beat. "You saw Clara there?" I asked, my voice strained. I tried to keep my cool, but I could feel my mind racing. "Yeah, she was with a group of people. Looked like she was having a good time, you know. She was all over the place, dancing, laughing, just vibing with the crowd. I even saw her talking to a guy in the corner. Don't know who he was, but they seemed pretty close." At that moment, everything froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my pulse quickened. Clara had been at the club, my club, without telling me. She had been out all night, and I had no idea. And then, hearing Ben describe how she was all over the place, my mind went into overdrive. What did that mean? Was she flirting with someone else? Had I missed something? I could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on me. I tried to maintain my composure, but I could tell Ben noticed the shift in my expression. He immediately backpedaled, sensing the tension in the air. I don't know, just thought it was weird, you know," Ben added, as if he could somehow undo what he'd just said. I forced a smile, but it didn't reach my eyes. "Thanks for the heads up, Ben," I muttered, pushing my coffee cup around absent-mindedly. "I'll talk to her." Ben nodded, but I didn't hear anything else he said. My mind was too clouded with thoughts of Clara and what had happened the previous night. It wasn't like her to hide things from me. And yet, now I found out she'd been at the club, partying until the early hours with some mystery guy. The more I thought about it, the more questions kept popping up. Had she been planning this? Did she want to go out and hook up with someone? I couldn't imagine it. Clara was always so committed, or so I thought. But now, there were cracks in the story, pieces of the puzzle I couldn't fit together. A few days passed, and the tension between Clara and me grew. She acted like nothing had happened, but I could feel the distance between us. I couldn't shake the thought that she had been hiding something, and that gut feeling only got worse. I started to notice more things. The way she'd sometimes look at her phone and quickly lock the screen when I walked by. The way she would suddenly leave the room when I was on the phone with a friend. And how she had become a little more aloof when we were together. I couldn't take it any more. One night, as she was getting ready to leave the house, I decided to confront her. I had to know the truth. "Clara," I said, trying to sound calm, though my heart was racing. "I need to know what's going on. I can't keep pretending everything is fine when I know it's not." She stopped in her tracks, glancing at me nervously. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaky. "What are you talking about?" "You know what I mean," I said, holding up my phone. "Ben told me he saw you at the club the other night. You were with some guy talking to him. What was going on?" Clara's face turned pale. She seemed to freeze for a moment, and I could see the panic in her eyes. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The silence between us felt deafening. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want you to find out this way." "Find out what?" I demanded. "Clara, what's going on?" She let out a long, shaky breath. I've been seeing someone else. It's Ben. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did." The ground beneath me seemed to shift. My whole world felt like it was crumbling. Ben, my friend, my trusted friend. I had never seen it coming. The shock hit me like a freight train, and I could barely process her words. "I didn't want to hurt you," she continued, her voice breaking. "But it just happened. I never meant for you to find out this way." My heart felt like it had been ripped from my chest. How could she do this to me? How could she betray me with Ben of all people? The betrayal was unbearable. "Why?" was all I could manage to say. Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. I was confused. It started as a stupid fling, and I didn't know how to stop it. I should have told you, but I didn't. I'm sorry." I shook my head, the pain unbearable. I can't believe this. You did this with my friend, and you didn't even have the decency to tell me." Clara didn't answer. The silence between us was deafening, and in that moment I knew nothing would ever be the same.